Today's lecture is on climate change, migration, and movement. And these three interrelated issues touch on some of the most pressing challenges of our time. So, as rising sea levels come in, we have extreme weather, resource scarcity. All these things force millions to leave their homes. And so we're faced with oftentimes difficult questions about justice, aspects of responsibility regarding our shared future. So in this lecture, we're going to be exploring the causes as well as the consequences of climate-induced migration and examining its impact on both displaced populations and the environment, as well as highlight how religious communities are responding with compassion and advocacy. Now, climate change has multifaceted effects in our understanding of the way in which ecology and spirituality all intersect, as it not only affects the planet as a whole, but also the way in which humans react morally, spiritually, as a result of these changes. So, for example, in Bangladesh, frequent flooding has already displaced millions of people. Entire villages have absolutely disappeared. And the people forced to move often face an aspect of hostility as they come into new communities. So places in the Pacific Islands where you're seeing rising sea levels threatening to submerge entire nations, like Kiribati, it creates this type of climate refugee, or a status of people who have nowhere to go. And so the environmental consequences are also fairly significant. So when large populations are migrating, and large portions of society are moving from one place to another, it can really put a lot of pressure on already fragile ecosystems in many of these host areas. So, for example, in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, deforestation has increased as displaced communities rely on wood for fuel. And these situations really illustrate the vicious cycle of climate change, where you have environmental degradation, which then leads to displacement, which then leads to exacerbated ecological damages in other areas. So, for example, in places like sub-Saharan Africa, we're seeing this impact of, not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but all over the world. But you're seeing the way in which climate change could drastically impact the way in which people have greater competition over shrinking fertile land. And over the past 50 years, when the surface temperatures across Africa have increased by 0.5 degrees centigrade and are projected to increase faster compared to other parts of the world, you're seeing the ways in which droughts are commonly becoming more frequent and intense and expected to get worse. Rainfall will become increasingly unpredictable, either not existent or just dumping on. So you're having potential for worse floods or dry soil. And the combination of both is not a good combination when you're having floods on dry soil. So you're having all this kind of happening, and as well as this aspect of desertification, where everything's becoming much more desert-like. It will reduce arable land available to farmers, as well as to pastoralists, the people who are using for grazing their cattle or whatever they're pasturing, and that creates a great deal of resource scarcity and environmental stresses that are going on in these communities. So, with higher temperatures and droughts, this will also reduce crop yields, which will then have adverse effects on health of the livestock, particularly for cattle, which people depend on for food as well as for other forms of livelihoods. So this impacts these regions in a number of ways. So people rely strongly on natural resources for their livelihoods, especially in many rain-fed farmlands and pastures. And so as a result, you're getting a battle for land between farmer communities and herding communities, which creates increased antagonism between these communities. We saw this in earlier examples in this class when we talked about what's going on in Ethiopia, where it's these forest churches that are kind of the last bastion of forests as a result of many of the farmers as well as the herding communities are taking up many of the lands and shrinking down a lot of the forests in the area. And so this, in combination with rapid growing populations in the last decades, has raised demand for an already scarce arable land. And with the state's capacity to adapt and cope fairly low, it effectively puts more of a widespread poverty population at an increased risk. So increased occurrences of weather extremes causing rainfall to become unpredictable, leading to more frequent and intense droughts and floods, is really problematic, particularly for the people who do not have a stable place to live or a stable income, and it becomes much more problematic. So while not all communities around the world, with a crossover between Aryan and pastoral communities, you can see how this will impact various global communities as people can no longer sustain an existence in those areas, and they'll be forced to leave or forced to fight for their land. There's been a number of studies that are actually looking at this increased tension of areas, and a lot of times people like say that religions are oftentimes the place where wars break out or tensions break out. It actually comes down to a matter of resource management and connections. So the more resources you have, the more water connections you have, it leads people to be much more willing and needing to fight over those resources. And oftentimes they bring in religious connections to give them a sense of power and connection. But what's interesting is that there's this one study that found that in the tropic from 1950 to 2004, the probability of new civil conflicts doubled in that period of time. So it went from 3% to 6%, actually during El Nino years, which much of the continent tropics becomes substantially warmer and drier during that period of time. And although they found that more temperate latitudes changes were less extreme, they concluded that El Nino and southerly oscillations may have influenced the development of 21% of civil conflicts since 1950. 21%. And in another study, they found that there's a strong association between warmer temperatures and civil war that existed between 1981 and 2002. And they predicted that a 54% increase in armed conflict in Africa by 2030. We're getting close to that, with approximately 393,000 battle-related deaths expected by 2030. We're seeing this happening, and we're seeing aspects of genocide happening in places like Sudan, which unfortunately don't get a lot of news attention because of the global focus, especially in the Western Hemisphere, to focus only on Western issues and ignoring genocides in other parts of the world. But you're seeing these happening, these issues coming as an increasing source of conflict around the world. There's another source from O'Loughlin and found that in East Africa between 1990 and 2009, the temperatures were much warmer than normal, and it increased the risk of violence. They found that in Somalia between 1997 and 2009, that drought that happened during that period of time fueled conflict through shocks in the price of livestock. And they predicted that if the average temp of East Africa rose by 3.2 degrees centigrade by 2100, the cattle prices would then fall about 4%, and violent conflict would increase by about 58%. So you're seeing all these ramifications as a result of climate change. It impacts us not only in